Morning, Kate. Hi. So we're just going to have a chat, aren't we, in relation to the lots of restructures and redundancies that are going on in the sector. They've been widely reported on. And also currently we know that a lot of universities are also running voluntary severance schemes. And if they're not currently doing that, something that they are anticipating that there might be a need to do that in the near future. And as those of us who work with the sector and in the sector have probably also seen Queen Mary's UCU website, which has got a list of current universities which are doing redundancy exercises. And so importantly, the universities are carefully planning for these exercises and implementing them, learning from each other as well, and seeking advice. And indeed, we're both working, aren't we, with various universities that are doing these exercises. But a part of the consideration is obviously, and what we're going to talk about, and we're going to briefly outline some points to remind universities of the relevant obligations that they have in relation to students and how the process and implementation of any restructure, redundancies or voluntary severance can be used to really ensure that the universities meet these obligations. Yeah. And so I suppose just to start, it would be helpful just as a reminder from your perspective in terms of, I suppose, the student contract and the obligations that universities have to students in this regard, Kate.
Yeah, thanks, Sian. I think, as you say, important when undertaking these exercises to think across the staff and the student piece at the same time. Clearly, you have, as an institution, you have a contract with your students, and whether they're undergraduates or postgraduates, you have promised to deliver them something. Now, your flexibility to do that is affected by the terms of the student contract that you have with them, but also by consumer law and the protections that are quite rightly in place to make sure that you don't just have the right as an institution to fundamentally change what you're going to offer to a student without them having any rights. So, I mean, ultimately, from my point of view, what you want to be doing is using a time machine and going back. If you're undertaking one of these exercises, is going back to the starting point of all of your applicants and students and looking at what have you promised them, what's on the website, what's in the student contract, which these days for most institutions, is actually a document called the student contract. But if you don't have one of those, it's going to be pieced together from lots of bits of documentation, policies, procedures, websites, and so on, and offer letters. So you want to make sure that what you are promising is helpful and flags when these sorts of changes might need to happen. That ought to be in your student contract, how and when you might need to vary it, and also in your student protection plan for these sorts of big changes that all institutions really are at risk of. What does happen if you decide to close down a course and so on? So yeah, from my point of view, very early on, you want to be building in all of these things, because clearly these relationships last years and there may have to be fundamental changes, but giving the applicant the opportunity to see when that might happen, why it might happen, what the process is when such things happen, how they're involved, what their rights are, is fundamental to compliance with consumer law.
And that's helpful. And I think there's the consideration, I suppose, from a staff point of view. And obviously, when universities are making the decision about this, they've got students at the heart of it. Often, and recently, it's affected by student numbers, but they're considering the impact on student continuation of their courses and student programs and what they've committed to in terms of their university courses. But the separate layer in terms of staffing, in terms of proposals as to whether it's the resourcing that's therefore required as an outcome of whatever decision or proposal that the university is making. And if that's reduced, then obviously that will lead to proposed redundancies, or prior to that, even the voluntary severance scheme, where often it's almost slightly trickier to manage if it's not a targeted voluntary severance scheme, because you're not quite clear where the volunteers might come from and where they're accepted, and therefore you might have fewer staff on particular programs or particular departments that have to manage. But really it's when there's the program closure, isn't it, or course closure, that the impact might be quite concentrated and it might have a more risk in terms of the student contract. So I suppose in the absence of a time machine, if we haven't got a time machine and you are where you are with whatever's in the student contract and whatever you've made clear to students at the outset and at the start of their program, I think it's worth just thinking about ways to mitigate that impact now, given that a lot of institutions are doing it now.
And so how do you go about doing that when you have voluntary severance, as you say, or these sort of big programs, restructuring programs?
And I think from a staffing perspective, as you said at the start, it's helpful to align what's happening with the staff and the students and make sure that the communications and the impact for both are considered together. But there are various mechanisms which universities are familiar with, but actually can be translated into what's agreed with staff and what's communicated to staff. So one that we're both familiar with is teach out. And so in a voluntary severance example, or even in a redundancy example, then it is possible to agree phasing of end dates, and you can have a two-part settlement agreement, for example, where actually somebody will agreeing that you're going to leave, but actually the course doesn't end until X date, and therefore you're going to timetable the person to teach right until that end. But it might be that you're reducing the staff during that process, so there's different numbers of staff, so you don't all have to have a later date, so you do manage to implement some cost saving sooner rather than later, but that can be included in a settlement agreement and negotiated with staff who are doing it via voluntary severance. Or if you're not doing it by voluntary severance and it is compulsory redundancies, then again you've got control over the end dates. You just need to be careful as to why you might be selecting one person to stay on longer than somebody else, whether it's particular timetabling or particular subject expertise that they're teaching on, or modules which the need means that it's different, so that you can distinguish the selection of particular staff over others. And similarly, in terms of phasing redundancy implementation for departments, that can also mitigate the impact on students so that there isn't a cut-off and you're losing all staff at the same time. And then another ways of doing it is even after staff have left. For example, PhD students, some universities can use honorary contracts without payment if there's just finishing off the PhD supervision because they're near the end of the completion of their PhD, then using honorary contract for the academic to continue to supervise one or two students to enable them to finish their PhD. And similarly, in terms of consultancy or re-engaging the individual on a separate basis for a time-limited period. So there are various ways that actually the engagement with staff and the ending of the employment with staff can be worked out so that it actually facilitates what you need to do in terms of your commitments to your students. And I suppose the other thing is communication, isn't it? And I suppose
always.
how universities can communicate with staff and students around it and respond to what's happening. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, communication's always it's at the heart of everything, isn't it? It's the heart of many of the issues that we end up dealing with, is the lack of communication or joined up communication. So I think, whether you have or haven't had your time machine and got all of your documents in order, it's going to be really important to communicate with, from my perspective, with those students, to explain to them what's happening, why, what their rights are, what their choices are. And that will obviously depend on the particular context, but a teach out is reasonably sort of comfortable territory, whereas say a supervisor leaving PhD student partway through, when there isn't going to be the expertise remaining within the university, that's much more difficult. So part of it will depend on having laid the groundwork, but always it's going to be proper engagement, so they don't feel that they're just isolated, being told what's happening to them without any say. And again, consumer law would expect that there's a genuine sort of consultation about significant changes, rather than a sort of done deal. So it would be about that engagement being earlier on in the decision-making process, not, right, this is what the institution's decided, we are now telling you what's happened.
Yes. And that's tricky at time in terms of the staff consultation because of the specific timescales that are required by statute in terms of the redundancy consultation, and the reluctance, justifiably so, for universities to go too early when actually there isn't a proposal yet to consult on, and therefore the consultation is going to be meaningful. But I still think there's the timing that actually the consultation can be meaningful for both students and staff when there is something to consult on, and making sure that the messaging is joined up, because actually students can have some solutions in terms of mitigating the impact on the staff, and actually thinking about how their programs might work differently, or any solutions to make it genuinely a meaningful consultation.
Yes.
They might have ways of thinking of mitigating or even avoiding the redundancies if it's joined up in terms of timing and also content, to the extent that that's reasonable. And I suppose that the same goes for when there's a strong reaction. I suppose we're used to, whether that being student process or staff industrial action, and they often join up from their side. We've got experience of that, but sometimes it's helpful to join up at the early stage to prevent and make sure that there's the meaningful consultation in order to prevent or mitigate that kind of strong reaction, because they're engaged in a positive way with the journey, even if the impact is ultimately one which is going to be perceived as negative if it results in redundancies or staff that's their course ending. It could be positively engaged in from early on. There's lots to think about, but there are kind of solutions, as you say, in the absence of a time machine. Obviously, prevention and preparation is ideal. You are where you are, as cliched as it is, and you're here. There are ways that actually you can mitigate that in implementing the proposals, or deciding on the proposals, and engaging with staff and students at that time, aren't there?
I mean, it's almost never too late to start addressing this. And to build in something meaningful that is actually helpful for the staff, the students, for everybody involved, and which will mitigate against any, let's face it, potential claims that students might have if they're not going to end up with what they were promised when they signed up for their particular student contract.
Yes. And I suppose we've seen that during the pandemic, haven't we? So it's well rehearsed in terms of that expectation. So it's a useful reminder at this point, isn't it, to not forget as the student contract, and to get in contact with us if they need help, either at the prevention stage or at the stage of implementation, so that we can help from both the staff and the student side. Thank you for listening, and please do get in touch if you would like advice on any of the issues that we've discussed today.